Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thanks for joining me. As always, appreciate the support of this project. I'm Rob Guller. For those who may not know me, this week's topic, I had promised that we were going to talk about election history, East Aurora's connection to election history. And this week's topic, some weeks I talk about things specific to East Aurora, and this one I think is more universal. That no matter where you live or whether you even know East Aurora or not, that you might find interesting. And this comes from students at East Aurora High School. I was invited to, as part of my job as town historian, to come to a history class at the high school to talk about Millard Fillmore and Millard Fillmore's legacy. And they're actually doing a really great project in discussing whether Millard Fillmore should be a forgotten president or was consequential and should be remembered, what his legacy is. And they were actually going to debate it. So they had me come up and chat about it as part of that process. But in that discussion, we were talking about Millard Fillmore, as a lot of us already know, is Millard Fillmore was the 13th president. He became president as a Whig, a member of the Whig Party, in 1850 when Zachary Taylor died. He was not renominated by his party. I've talked about this before, and you can read about it of why he was not renominated by his party. And the Whigs actually split and fell apart as a political party. So he was not renominated in 1852, but the election of 1856 comes along, and he becomes involved in this third party called the American Party, or the Know Nothings. And the Democrats and the Republican Party had formed by that point, and had put up a candidate for president. And Millard Fillmore was nominated as part of this right wing group of mostly former Whigs who had this anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic stance. They were concerned about immigration. This might sound familiar because history is repeating itself with some factions of political candidates today. But he was the third party candidate, and it's often written off Millard Fillmore's candidacy, and I talked about this before, and there's a whole bunch of things about that candidacy. But for today's purposes, I'm not going to get involved in the political party stance and what the election, what the issues were during that election. For today's purposes, I want to talk about how well he did in the election. A lot of times when people look back at that election of 1856, they say Millard Fillmore was uh, kind of relegate him to that third party stance and that position as a third party, and that he only won one state. He won the state of Maryland. However, so if you look at a map, and you'll see these colors on the maps of historical elections, and you go back to the election of 1856, you'll just see Maryland painted usually purple, sometimes a pink color, to represent the American Party and Millard Fillmore. And this grossly underestimates the number of votes that Millard Fillmore received. Uh, so we were talking about this in the class at the high school, and when you actually look at the popular vote, Millard Fillmore received about 21% of the popular vote in that election. One Only one state, a single state in the Electoral College. So a lot of people don't see his candidacy as significant, especially since it was such a controversial by today's standards, most certainly, but even back then, the nativist feelings and the anti-immigration, anti-Catholic stance of the Know Nothing Party, people kind of just relegate it, but it really did. It got 21% of the vote. So 21% of the people went out to vote, voted for this third party, which does not get reflected in those maps. So that got me to thinking. So that's sort of an East Aurora connection. Millard Fillmore was, of course, lived here for 10 years and started his political career in East Aurora. Um, and so that got me thinking. I had been thinking about this topic for a while, but Millard Fillmore and his run for president in 1856 got me thinking again about these red blue maps that we have gotten used to probably in the last 50 years or so, more so in the last 20, 25 years, and how they kind of distort how we look back on historical elections. And and it is a problem, I think, because especially with the way our brains think about the colors. The colors kind of give us a warped view of the actual results of an election. and how they trick our brain into thinking something that may not be true or exaggerates one side, one political party or another. And I know you've heard this on TV and in news reports and all this about how the National Electoral College map distorts the significance of states with low populations. So when you look at a geographic map of the United States and they color the states red states or blue states, the red states are overrepresented. The Republican states are represented because the geographic area of those states is larger. So the cities are smaller, but there's a lot more people in them. And just as an aside, this red-blue color scheme for the political parties actually just started in the 2000 election, uh, uh, where they kind of came to consensus. All the news networks came to this consensus of the red and the blue, red for Republican and blue for Democrat. But before that, the news stations in their political coverage were using colors, but they didn't always agree on which color was which. So actually, I think it was ABC News. Either 80 or 84 used red. They flipped. They had been doing Democrats as red and Republicans as blue, but they flipped because I think it was David Brinkley in the coverage, if I remember correctly. It said, uh, "We're putting the Republican states in that election in red because red for Reagan, because Reagan was running." So it wasn't necessarily red for Republican; it was red for Reagan. And before that, a lot of the stations would do it blue for Republican and red for Democrat, the opposite of what we do today, because in Britain and in Canada, the Liberal parties or the Labour parties were always red. Their official color was red. And the Conservative Party was always blue, and it still is. The Conservatives in Canada have adopted blue and red for the Liberal parties, and then in Britain, the same for Labour and the Conservative Party. It's the opposite of the political ideologies of the United States. But after the 2000 election and that red and blue state situation, it's pretty solidified that the red represents Republican and the Democrats are blue. So it wasn't always that way. So if you're looking in old newspapers or old coverage, you may see it differently. Um, but the color scheme has become a thing since newspapers started printing in color and news networks were able to color television sets would come out. So once color television sets came out and people could see the colors, the news networks saw an opportunity to do this snazzy map of the United States on election night and show you blue states and red states and color the map. Before that, it really didn't happen. They would kind of list, if you go just YouTube old election night coverage, you won't necessarily see a map out in all cases. They'll do like a tally of the states. So this visual that we have of red and blue and on a map the way it is fairly new. It's not something that's been around since the beginning of the time, and especially since the year 2000. So um, these maps trick our brain, so to speak. So if you look at the plains, Kansas, North Dakota, all the states in the center of the country that tend to vote Republican, they have a lower population, and so you'll see the maps and you'll think that our brain is tricked into thinking that the Republicans have more support or more votes. When in fact they might not have as many votes. So like at the West Coast and the East Coast, New York City has a ton of population. Los Angeles has a ton of population, but it's a small dot on that big map. So our brain is tricked, and you've heard this before. And they say that there's been reports and articles about this, how our brain is tricked because of we're seeing the election results based off the geography, not the population. And in some cases, news organizations will do a map that's based. They'll size the states based on population to try to make it look fair. But I don't see that very often. We like to see the United States geographically. So you'll see the states represented geographically, which doesn't always give you a true sense of how many people are voting for a particular candidate. Now, why am I talking about this in a local history live stream? Well, the news organizations with the technology, particularly the New York Times, and I'm going to post it um, in the comment section. And if you're watching on YouTube, head over to either the Facebook or if you're not watching on YouTube, I'm sorry, Instagram. I can't always put links, but if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, I'll put the link in the comments, or you can just Google 2020 election map New York Times, and they have this, they call it an extremely detailed map of the 2020 election. And they also do it, you can also click for results from the 2016 election. And at first they were doing results you could look up on the internet, on the New York Times and some other sites, a map of the United States based on state, and they would put the state electoral vote. Then they were able to narrow down with the technology to gather election results fairly quickly and through internet communication, and the reports, precincts were reporting their elections electronically. They could get these maps pretty quickly and the results pretty quickly. They were doing it by county. So you would have a result of, you could tell how many, which counties voted for which presidential candidate. Now they can do it by precinct, and except for a couple states, they'll post. There's this great map that you can narrow down basically to your neighborhood to see how your neighborhood voted for the president in the presidential election in 2020 and 2016, and presumably they're going to do it this time around as well. So if you click on and you zoom into the town of Aurora, and we'll just do that as an example, you'll see that the town of Aurora is pretty geographically split. The northern part that includes the village voted for the Democrat, Joe Biden, in 2020, and the southern half, Griffin's Mills, West Falls, voted for Donald Trump, the Republican, if you're just looking at the map. And this is where it could be deceiving. So I see blue on the top and red on the bottom, or blue in the north, red in the south of the town of Aurora. However, and they do try. So the New York Times in their map here will have different intensities of the shade of blue or the shade of red to show you how much more the Republican or Democratic candidate won the election by. So the darker the red, the more vote, the more spread there was percentage-wise. The darker the blue, the more that district favored Hillary Clinton and/or Joe Biden, depending on which election you're looking at. However, I noticed that when I looked at it, I was like, oh, the northern part voted for Joe Biden, the southern part voted for Donald Trump. My brain was tricked into thinking that that blue meant Democrat and red meant Republican, and I did not think about the exact numbers. So you talk about blue states and red states, but you're not thinking by how much. So as a perfect example is and I don't know the numbers of the districts. There are numbers of the election districts the precincts that this map represents. But the northwestern quadrant of the town of Aurora back in 2020 is shaded blue, a light blue, but blue. And so you're like, oh, that district voted for Joe Biden. But when you dig into the numbers and you actually click on the district on this map that the New York Times has, which is fantastic, you'll see that Joseph Biden got 50% of the vote and Donald Trump got 48% of the vote. 521 votes to 499. So a 22 vote difference. Pretty even, pretty close. 20 votes difference, 58% to 48%. But our brain is tricked because of this colorful map into thinking that Joe Biden may have won by more than he did. Now, contrary to that is there is a district in the village that is 67 to Joe Biden and 31 for Donald Trump. It is shaded a darker blue, but I don't know. I would be interested in hearing how you think about this. I just see blue and think Democrat, and so one district is 67% to 31, and the other one is pretty even, 50 to 48. It could have easily been red. In fact, that northwestern district in the town of Aurora voted for Trump in 2016. And there's a cool little map on the New York Times website that'll you can see the change from 2016, and it'll click you right over to how the vote changed. and how much more they voted for the Democrat or how much they voted for the Republican. Same thing happens on the Republican side. So out in some of the West Falls districts, Donald Trump got 53% and Joe Biden got 45. It's shaded red. Um, they did vote for Donald Trump, but Joe Biden, it was much more even than it would be somewhere else that's shaded red. Go into Wyoming County, there are actually districts out there that are like 80-20, 85-15% in favor of the Republican candidate. But our brains kind of equalize them. So the point being that when you look at these cool maps, and a lot of places are doing, or a lot of media organizations are doing them now because they're really cool to look at, it's an easy way to present the election results, but I think it tricks our brain. And it's not just that national map, it's the local maps that when you're digging down, now that we have the ability to do it, and the Buffalo News tends to do it every year after the election, they'll put a map either on the front page of their election section because we love to see how our neighbors voted. We love to see how our town voted, especially in a presidential election. But when you're looking back on these historical maps, we have to dig deeper into them because often I'll have heard that, throughout history, I'll hear that, Aurora's a Republican town. But, and that may have been the case. We actually have been voting for the Democrat. But when you say that, okay, how much are you voting for the Democrat? Yeah, we might be a Democratic town when it comes to the presidential election, but when you look at some of the results, it's not by much. So it's interesting to look at it that way. Now, and also when you pull out on the map, the city of Buffalo is dark, dark blue, as to be expected. But it's such a smaller part of the map that it looks like it's not as much as it should be represented. Wyoming County has about the same population as the town of Amherst. But Wyoming County is 16 towns, this huge swath of land, and you're seeing a big red section. But when you look at that, that's the same population as the town of Amherst, which on the map has a really small part of that map. So our brain gets tricked into thinking that maybe the Republican Party in this case, but it could go the other way, has a much bigger voting block than the city of Buffalo, which and the Democrats. When in fact the Democrats are just pulling their votes from a much smaller geographical area. Most interesting is there are some, if you, and I encourage you to kind of look around these maps, is you'll notice the city of Buffalo, they'll show you the change from 2016, like how much they either voted more for the Democrat or the Republican. And there are precincts in Buffalo that more people voted for Trump in 2020 than did in 2016, and I found that very interesting. While a lot of places in Erie County, it shows that more people voted for the Democrat Joe Biden more than Hillary Clinton. But it's interesting to see that that the city of Buffalo, more people voted for Trump in lots of precincts, and sometimes by a lot. Than they did the 4 years earlier. So I'd be intrigued to see as when the maps come out after the upcoming election, what they'll show. But just remember to be careful when you're looking back in history and how people voted. Think of Millard Fillmore, that, yeah, he's often, his run for the presidency, controversial run for the presidency in 1856 is often just kind of pushed aside as just a third party run, but he got a lot of votes. 20, almost 21% of the popular vote went to Millard Fillmore, and he actually came really close to winning more electoral votes in the South. But that's not represented in the maps because the maps are either red or blue, and they don't show you, by how much often. We just color in the map, which gives us a distorted view. Not only on the national maps, but also as these maps are getting much more sophisticated. And they're also doing historical maps that are much more sophisticated. So as we study this history and try to figure out how we voted in past elections, we have to be very, very careful with these maps. The blue and the red trick our brain a lot, and it doesn't give us a true representation of how people were voting in elections. You'll see that too in old elections. When I did some research on particularly the 1912 election and the 1916 election. I wanted to know how the Roycrofters were kind of voting, and then when women's suffrage was on the ballot, I wanted to know how we were voting. And I fell into this trap where it was I was like the town of Wales was voting a certain way, and the town of Aurora, well, um, Aurora has more people than the town of Wales, and so to equate the two population-wise, when you're trying to get a picture of how the entire area voted, we have to remember that the population differences of these towns makes a difference. The towns geographically are the same size, but the number of people in them is not. So to say that Wales maybe voted no on a proposition and Aurora voted yes is not the same thing when it comes to how many people are voting and things like that. So we have to remember that as we study that history, and we often get uh, um, an unrealistic view sometimes of voting patterns and how people voted back throughout history, on a national level, on a state level, and also in our local elections and presidential elections, and in the local in local elections. With that said, I'm going to, in the coming weeks, talk about how we voted locally for presidential elections throughout history. It's going to be one of the things I talk about. I'm one of those weird people who find it fun to look through old newspapers and records and figure out that sort of thing. And I did go back to as far as I could, 1870s or so, to record how we in our individual community, East Aurora, town of Aurora, voted in each presidential election throughout history. And there are some interesting things in there. So, and I hope you find it interesting too. So that'll be coming up in the next few weeks as we get closer and closer to the presidential election. So thank you for this topic idea, the students at East Aurora High School, in a roundabout way, as we were talking about Millard Fillmore. And again, keep your comments coming. Again, these videos are available on YouTube as well, and I post them on Instagram. And thank you for the support. The numbers keep going up of viewers, so I appreciate that. If you have any topic ideas, either pop them in the comments or send me a private message, as you always do, and I appreciate that. And again, I am Robert Goller. I am the Town and Village Historian here in East Aurora, but these videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected with my position as Town and Village Historian. So thank you very much for joining me, and we will see you next time. Thanks. Have a good one.